Hello and welcome to Pride Mix here at Gaze at the National Parks, the podcast. June is LGBTQIA plus Pride Month, and during the month of June, our Trail Mix episodes are called Pride Mixes.
Pride Mix is a chance for us to dive deep into queer history, and in some cases, how queer history intersects with the national parks and the National Park Service's role as America's storyteller.
While our Pride Mixes have focused on different topics each season, our goal has always been to underscore the importance of queer history while also highlighting queer individuals and watershed moments and places that have been further recognized by the NPS.
As we reflect on this moment in history and the attacks on the queer community from divisive voices, it is clear that one part of the LGBTQIA+ banner has faced more backlash, hate, and violence than most. And they are also part of our community that acted as trailblazers and torchbearers for us in our fight for equality, that being the trans community.
The plight of this part of the queer rainbow has been a long-standing one, as regressive laws and policies have only further hampered them and robbed them of their personhood. They've become a constant scapegoat for the right, who fails to hold a mirror up to their own misgivings and illicit affairs, and instead deflects towards people who are strong and resilient, but also constantly placed in legally precarious positions just for being themselves.
In this year's Pride Mix episodes, we want to take the time to provide a platform to the history of the trans community so that others may understand not only their importance in the fight for queer equality, but better understand trans individuals in historical context, the aggression they currently face, and the joy that may be found in the face of all of it, so that we all may be better allies to our trans family and community members.
Before we start, we want to take a moment to cite our main source for these episodes, Susan Stryker's Transgender History, which is an incredible resource that is a thorough guide. This publication is readily available online to peruse at your own leisure.
Okay, so how much do you know about queer history as it relates to trans folks?
Well, if we want to take a moment and forget that I wrote this episode,
Right.
Before this, the breadth of my knowledge really was surrounding Stonewall and Sylvia Rivera and Marsha P. Johnson. We have produced a bunch of episodes in previous Pride Mixes, but really my knowledge base as far as general scope of history of transgendered individuals and how that has progressed over time was pretty minimal. What about you?
I think similar. I am definitely more familiar with trans individuals that we have researched and shared the stories of here during Pride Mix in previous seasons. I have done some work with the Pride Center of New Jersey and their trans support group. But as far as the actual individuals who made the waves of trans history, I was less familiar with that. And so I'm doing the research for the next episode, which is the one that I wrote in this series, was not only incredibly enlightening, but definitely helps me to be a better ally. Perhaps an important place to start, prior to diving into the history of trans individuals, is to first define a few commonly used words that surround people who are transgender to better have the vocabulary to understand what is often misunderstood. 5 words stand out initially: sex, gender, sexuality, cisgender, and intersex. While other important vocabulary may come up in the context of these episodes, these words illuminate and uncover a lot of what is often misconstrued and therefore confused.
As Salt and Peppa said, "Mayhaps we shall talk about sex, beloved?" Sex and gender are not the same thing. Sex is biological, and it refers to the ability of one's reproductive capacity and whether they produce eggs or sperm. Biologically, egg-producing individuals are said to be of the female sex, and sperm-producing individuals are said to be of the male sex. But sex, like gender, is not binary, as intersex individuals also exist. Sex relates on a chromosomal level and is different from gender. Those individuals born with XX chromosomes being biologically female, and those born with XY chromosomes being biologically male.
So what is gender then? Gender, unlike sex, is not biological, but rather social. For much of Western history, as societies, we organized into genders that have been reflective of our sex and our biology. However, gender is much broader than this, especially in non-Western cultures. Many indigenous people, for example, have organizations that are based beyond two specific sex-related genders. Sex may be the actor, but gender is the role that they play. Gender roles have been reorganized organized throughout history, and some things that are now viewed as typically female were once male-specific. The smallest example of that being that pink was once a color that was incredibly fashionable for men to wear, and only in the 20th century did this gender stereotype or norm become more associated with females. Gender relates to the way we carry ourselves, the clothes we wear, the way in which we talk, our mannerisms, and our gait, among other things. The role that gender has played in society throughout history has often dictated the roles in which men and women were able to take up within their home, in the workplace, and in their family dynamics. As the 20th century marched onward, lines became blurred and long-held tradition and norms became more fluid, allowing the sexes to upend the prescribed system.
Now that we have a foundation for sex and gender, what is sexuality? Sexuality describes the bodies and people we find attractive. While sex and sexuality are different, they are inevitably tied to one another. Though many people would fall into the categories of heterosexual, homosexual, or bisexual, asexuality, having no desire for other people, or autosexuality, finding enjoyment from oneself alone, are terms that also populate the field. However, these terms are not the only ones that stand, as sexuality is a spectrum and is also adaptive depending on the person and their stage of life. Sexuality for many is also a journey of discovery, even though it is often presented as potentially very black and white choices.
Having described the basics of sex, sexuality, and gender, there are two other important terms that are helpful in understanding where we are headed as we talk about the history of transgender individuals. The first is cisgender. Cisgender acts as an additional descriptor to better underscore the biological sex of an individual that is not transitioned, whereas a transgender individual may either just be referred to as transgendered without a biological qualifier, or as a transgender man or transgender woman. Cisgender, or sometimes cissexual, further qualify the individual as a non-transition person.
The last term to talk about is related to sex, but is sometimes confused with what it is to be transgender. That term is intersex. While most individuals that are born biologically male are sperm-producing and have male sex characteristics, most born biologically female are egg-producing. In about 1 in 2,000 births, some people are born intersex. This may mean that the individual born biologically male at birth may appear to be female, or that a biologically born female person may be born without their reproductive system, or that these individuals born either biologically male or biologically female may have a mix of male and female sex organ. So vocabulary building is always so great because it really just helps us to better understand things that we think we might know, but diving into those terms definitely fleshed out my understanding of them.
Of course. And also, the other thing I like about the building of these terms, and of course there are many subterms underneath these terms, and like there's something like, an array of genders, like across the spectrum. But what I love about this is that this is the very beginning of saying like, oh, no, the boxes, there are no boxes.
Yeah.
Right? Like these are all terms, and one can be any or many of these things all at one time. And it just sort of like helps us to see how beautifully constructed and deeply varied each person is. Yeah. And because there are so many ways in which to describe ourselves.
Absolutely. We contain multitudes.
Exactly. Before we talk about the history of transgender individuals, I think it's important to state that none of this information on sexuality, gender, intersex individuals, or transgender individuals is new. Biologically, even if endowed by our creator with thought, the ability to think and communicate, we are still members of the animal kingdom, and much of the biology, gender dynamics, and sexuality that we just discussed come into play in the rest of the animal kingdom all the time. We are just the assholes who thought that these differences were wrong and have been punishing people for much of recorded history because of it. We can't help our biology. We can only grow to understand it and become more compassionate towards others who may be other. I'm just going to take a second here to plug the book Queer Ducks and Other Animals that goes into all of that information. And if you listen to the audiobook, you might hear a familiar voice.
Well, human gender, sexuality, and biological sex have been studied and written about for quite some time, and while many non-Western societies have even come to recognize genders outside of the binary male and female, like the Mahu of Polynesia and Hawaii, the Bugis of Indonesia, and the Hira of India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, among many others, finding history of trans individuals has been quite a daunting task for historians and scholars. Though intersex and third-sex individuals have existed through recorded history, the way in which we now refer to or think about transgendered individuals, while often but not always having gender-affirming surgery, was not always well documented, nor could it be well studied in the narrower view of what gender and sexuality was, especially in the Eurocentric Western world. Before trans history became more widely studied on the academic front, much of learned history that related to transgendered individuals came from doctors, psychologists, and the individuals themselves, if they had documented or journaled about their lives.
That being said, Western historians have well-documented individuals who have cross-dressed or bucked gender norms through their nonconformity, whether it was through subterfuge or for patriotism, as was often the case in times of war, or because the individual truly felt more in their body and in that gender that felt appropriate to them despite their sexual characteristics. These historical figures may not have felt that the word transgender, had it been around in their time period, may have applied to them. That's because some individuals from history that wore the typical clothing of the opposite gender may have had no urge toward body modification. From the perspective of psychologists like Magnus Hirschfeld, a luminary in the study of sex, gender, and sexuality in the 20th century, these individuals, which he called transvestites, a now out of favor term, fell somewhere in the between, not pure female or pure male, but other.
When we look at the history of transgendered individuals, Western historical context takes us to the middle of the 19th century, when there was a greater documentation on the subject. Greater, but not profound. And in order to better understand transgendered individuals, understanding burgeoning queerness and queer epicenters is important. From the middle of the 19th century to the early 20th century, a great deal was changing in the fabric of society that allowed for greater individual freedom apart from family or community dynamics in which individuals were raised. As cities boomed and industry swept in, there was a great need for workers to fill positions, and oftentimes men would leave rural communities and their families for better opportunities that cities provided. These circumstances allowed gay communities to develop as men who felt other were allowed an opportunity to invent or reinvent themselves in spaces where no one knew them and where there was less shame and fear in leading a lifestyle they felt most at home with. Similarly, for women, this came much later in the earlier part of the 20th century as major steps in women's liberation came with the right to vote and the similar opportunities that men had in urban environments as women became more viable employees in an expanding labor market.
As society and technology advanced through the 20th century, so did medical science and a variety of doctors and scientists who would play roles in better understanding not only the human body and its intricacies, but also the mind. While medical advancement allowed for safer surgery and the possibility for bodies to be altered safely, at this early point in history, gender-affirming care was not where it was today. And for the most part, psychiatric professionals near the turn of the century were working to define terms that better describe human sexuality that are now commonplace today. One of these individuals is the aforementioned Magnus Hirschfeld. Other psychiatric professionals came before Hirschfeld, like Karl Heinrich Ulrichs and Karl Maria Kurtbenny. But Hirschfeld's advocacy and reach went much further. Along with being a contemporary of Sigmund Freud, Hirschfeld in 1897 co-founded the Humanitarian Committee, which is often regarded as the first organization in the world that worked toward reform on the part of sexual minorities. In 1919, he founded the Institute of Sexual Science in Berlin, and in 1928 became the founding president of the World League of Sexual Reform. Among all these important titles and the founding and participation of these various organizations, Hirschfeld was a major champion for transgendered individuals. He, and a host of other progressive medical experts that worked with him in Berlin, allowed for what would be a more burgeoning movement for transgendered individuals post-World War II, along with publishing studies, spearheading surgery, and working on the cutting edge of better understanding human sexuality and gender. Hirschfeld was a pioneer in the field of human sexuality, which allowed the work of others to grow, especially in regards to trans individuals.
Several other social scientists and psychiatrists like Carl Bowman, Alfred Kinsey, and Berlin-born and Hirschfeld apprenticed Harry Benjamin would continue the work along with the help of others like Louise Lawrence, a biological male living in California who began began living life as a woman in 1942. Lawrence started a network of transgendered individuals which operated via correspondence and came about through newspaper and personal advertisements. Lawrence was a linchpin in connecting trans individuals with doctors and psychiatrists and allowed a generation of researchers to learn more about transgendered individuals through their own interaction with them, as Lawrence used her own home as a sort of hub. One individual who Lawrence corresponded with was Virginia Prince, who became an emerging figure in the early history of trans rights, as she, despite her own feelings about transgendered issues and homosexuality, was a biological male who began living full-time as a woman in 1968. Her magazine, Transvestia, was the first widely spread publication which dealt with issues of cross-dressing, or what her magazine was specific to state were heterosexual men who dressed in women's garb. A complicated figure in trans history, nonetheless, she brought about the attention and advocacy work to both educate and ensure fair treatment of trans individuals, even though her own view was quite narrow and specific.
While there were few sex reassignment surgeries that took place in the United States in the 1950s, these surgeries were slightly more commonplace in Europe. One of the most attention-grabbing headlines of 1952 was the gender-affirming care surgery of Christine Jorgensen, who was identified male at birth in 1926, but transitioned in Denmark 26 years later. This surgery became a watershed moment for transgendered individuals, as much of it was an inflection moment for gender norms within the United States, as men and women in post-World War II America struggled to discover what their roles were in a peacetime world. While Jorgensen became an international sensation and a beacon for many, she also helped to redefine what transgendered was versus what a transvestite or crossdresser was, as Virginia Prince had defined in Transvestia. Prince, who would face and avoid legal troubles through obscenity laws for correspondence with another cross-dressing male who was already under federal investigation for obscenity-based correspondence with others, would actually prove to be an incredibly important figure in trans rights despite her narrow views. She started the Hose and Heels Club, and that is hose like pantyhose, which morphed into the Foundation for Personality Expression, which eventually had several chapters across the country. She was also a pioneer in pushing for changing the gender designation on state-issued identification. These moves were seismic in the grand scheme of transgender rights, despite what seemed to be an incredibly personal view of what it meant to be as such.
So that's a lot of history packed into 50 years, essentially.
Yeah, a lot. I definitely heard of Christine Jorgensen, of course, but and she's mentioned quite a bit when you look into transgender history.
Well, it was, again, totally a watershed moment. She became
totally a watershed moment.
An overnight celebrity, essentially, because this was also something that really hadn't been completely done before, or at least done in the very public eye.
Right.
But I think that's also what helps people to understand is visibility. So the willingness of Jorgensen to sort of be this visible figurehead almost allowed the conversation to continue to surround what it is to be other.
Right.
Because I think about the 1950s and the nuclear family,
yes,
and just like very white and straight.
Mm-hmm. And 2.5 kids.
And 2.5 kids with that torso just rolling around on the lawn.
Right.
Yeah. So no, it is leaps and bounds here when it comes to the history of transgendered individuals, and especially even just when it comes to medical care and therapy. I feel like those are things that just exploded in a way that allowed for better understanding and also better care.
Hey y'all, it's Dusty and Mike with exciting news.
That's right, it's our episode finder. It's all about making finding our episodes even easier.
Want to find more episodes about hikes in Shenandoah? With over 10 episodes across 2 separate seasons, it would have involved a lot of scrolling and searching.
Now, with our episode finder, you can find all those episodes with a few easy clicks. That way, finding an episode on Yosemite from season 1 is just as easy as finding an episode on Zion, Yellowstone, and Haleakala, all in separate seasons.
With over 275 episodes in 35 different national parks, our episode finder will add ease when finding out more about hikes in these spaces.
But it's not just about hikes by national park. We've categorized our entire library so you can find hikes by state, hikes by terrain, and hikes by difficulty.
And all of our Trail Mix episodes are there too, so you can easily find our science-based episodes, interviews, and more.
Planning a trip to Colorado and want to hear more about our adventures there? Want to grunt it out on some really tricky trails or learn more about glaciers, grasslands, and mountains?
Just click the link in our show notes or on our Instagram bio, and it pops right up. You can also head directly to our website and look for the episode finder at the top of the navigation bar.
Conquer one hike in one national park, one park at a time, with just a few clicks with our episode finder. Happy trails! While transgendered individuals were certainly more present in the media and were starting to help others to define what it meant to be transgendered, the fight for queer rights as a whole within the United States was brewing. Several incidents that involved queer individuals, specifically transgendered, cross-dressing, or those in drag, became flashpoints to what would become a much bigger event at the Stonewall Inn in New York City in 1969. The Cooper's Donut incident in Los Angeles in May of 1959, when drag queens were rounded up as their appearances did not match their identification, saw the queer community push back against the police for their targeted behavior. Similarly, the Dewey's Lunch Counter incident in Philadelphia in 1965 pushed the queer community towards acts of civil disobedience when Dewey's started to refuse individuals who are wearing clothing that was gender nonconforming. The community showed up for sit-ins, picketing, and flyering to help educate about the discrimination that was occurring at this long-standing haunt of the queer community.
A year later, in 1966, the Compton's cafeteria riot took place, which in many ways acted as a tipping point towards Stonewall. Compton's, similar to Cooper's Donuts in LA and Dewey's Lunch Counter in Philly, were haunts and hangouts for the queer community. On a summer weekend evening, a riot ensued when a police officer grabbed a drag queen in an attempt to arrest them, and they threw the coffee in their hand in the police officer's face. Tired of being harassed and treated poorly, the queer community took a stand and pushed back. This incident came with a lot of lead up, as transgendered individuals were frequently targeted for police harassment in the Tenderloin neighborhood of San Francisco, where Compton Cafeteria was located. Along with being arrested and forced into sex acts by police officers, they were, despite having top surgery, still defined as biological males and placed in men's jails, which further made them targets of sexual violence. On top of all of this, economic conditions and city gentrification and urban planning in San Francisco had pushed many of the poorest individuals to the outskirts of the city, leaving Tenderloin as one of the few affordable areas to live. Since transgender individuals could easily be denied housing or rental opportunities, they often lived in the cheap hotels that were available and could be paid for by the week. While organizations like Vanguard were formed, a queer youth organization who were interested in radical democracy, and tried to work within the community, including by interceding and working towards less discriminatory attitudes with the management of Compton's and similar protesting techniques that were employed at Dewey's Lunch Counter in Philadelphia, tension still boiled over. We cover many of these incidents in greater detail in our Pride Mix, Tamara Ching and the Compton's Cafeteria riots.
At the height of all this social upheaval, there was still hope, as individuals who were seeking to fully transition had more options. In the same year as the Compton's Cafeteria riot, Dr. Harry Benjamin had published his book, The Transsexual Phenomenon, which advocated for the types of research, treatment, and surgery that Magnus Hirschfeld had in Germany prior to the rise of Nazism. This brought about a drastic change in both the legal and medical fields, inching towards possibilities for trans individuals that had been available in Europe for almost 50 years at this point. Organizations formed in San Francisco, including the first transsexual peer support group called COG, or COG, Conversion Our Goal, as well as a unit of the San Francisco Public Health Department called the Center for Special Problems, which helped to work with transgendered individuals within the city. Across the country, Labyrinth was formed by Mario Martino, the first organization to help transgendered men navigate the ways to access newly available medical services for these individuals. These advancements felt like light speed considering all that had been available across the Atlantic for so long. That being said, there was still a long way to go and more freedom to be won.
One of the most pivotal moments in queer rights and equality was the riots at the Stonewall in 1969. And I just want to put in right here, Stonewall was not the posh bar. This was the bar where like the low end of the community hung out, right? This is where the sex workers hung out. This is often where trans folks hung out, trans folks who were sex workers. This was not Julius's around the corner, which was like the gay male spot. This was the spot for everybody else. So it was sort of like a counterculture. I think you probably meant
the white gay male spot.
Oh, Julia says? Yeah, absolutely. It was the white gay male spot. This was sort of like the counterculture spot to like, especially like white gay male spaces. Similar to the events that lead to the Revolutionary War, the precipitating incidents of the push for equality were not tied to this moment, but rather like a snowball coming down a mountain, gathering both speed and material until arriving for impact and future action. Stonewall was the impact. In a similar fashion to Cooper's Donuts, Dewey's Lunch Counter, and Compton's, police involvement and harassment had run its course, and the patrons of Stonewall were done. While police raids were common and the bar would shutter, it would often reopen after bribe money was paid. On June 28th, things were different and agitation ran high, as the typical raid was anything but. Police arresting individuals on the spot. The crowd put its foot down and pushed back, the protest growing even larger the following night as queens, queers, and trans folks joined forces and pushed back against the constant harassment.
Well, organizations like the Gay Liberation Front and its offshoot, Gay Activist Alliance, formed in the wake of Stonewall. They were fairly exclusionary to transgendered individuals, and they therefore formed their own groups. The transgendered leaders who were at Stonewall, Sylvia Rivera and Marsha P. Johnson, had a hand in forming STAR, Street Transvestite Action Revolutionaries, providing food and clothing and a safe space for kids on the street to live. They hoped to help queer kids in ways that they had not been helped in their youth. Another activist and leader, Angela K. Douglas, helped to form the Transsexual Activist Organization in 1970, which became the first international grassroots transgendered community organization which had chapters worldwide.
The advancements of trans visibility and trans rights came a long way from the turn of the mid-19th century to now, and these advancements were by no means easily won. Despite all of this, queer equality and liberation along with trans rights continues to surge, but not without a cost, as we will hear more about that in the second episode of this year's Pride Mix series.
Looking for more episodes like the one you just heard? Then be sure to check out our episode finder for episodes by park, state, hiking difficulty, and terrain, as well as all of our Trail Mix episodes in one helpful place. Click the link in the show notes of this episode, our Instagram bio, or visit our website to make your listening experience even easier.
This has been Gaze at the National Parks, the podcast, and we're here to remind you to hike early and hike often, and that adventure is always out there.
Gaze at the National Parks was created, produced, edited, and hosted by us,
Dustin Ballard
and Michael Ryan.
To see images from this episode, follow our Instagram at Gaze at the National Parks. To contact us, email us at gazeatthenationalparks@gmail.com. And to find out more about the parks visited on this show, visit our website, gazeatthenationalparks.com. That's Gaze, G-A-Z-E.
All original artwork featured on Instagram and on our website is by me, Michael Ryan.
All original music was written and performed by Dave Seaman and Mariella Klinger, with Sean Sklios on guitar. Our music producer is Skylar Fortgang.
We would also like to acknowledge that while recording this episode, that we were on the traditional and stolen lands of the Lenape people, also known as New Jersey.